All right, so today we're taking a deep dive into something I'm sure we've all experienced at some point, the dreaded hangover.
Ugh, don't remind me.
But here's a thought to kick things off. Archaeological evidence suggests that hangovers might actually be older than, well, us.
Older than us? How is that possible?
Well, think about it. Humans have been intentionally fermenting drinks since at least 10,000 BCE.
So you're saying our ancestors were dealing with hangovers even before aspirin or, heck, even written language?
Exactly. They were toughing it out without any of the modern comforts we rely on today.
That's kind of wild when you think about it. So for this deep dive, we're going way back using archaeology, ancient texts, even artwork and literature to piece together the history of the hangover.
It's a fascinating journey, and it really makes you wonder, what did our ancestors think about hangovers?
Right, like do they see it as some kind of punishment, a badge of honor, or just an inevitable part of life?
Well, we might have a clue, because there's actually a debate about whether the desire for, let's say, adult beverages might have been one of the driving forces behind the development of agriculture.
Okay, now that's interesting. Imagine those early humans enjoying their primitive brews and realizing, hey, if we want more of this, we need a reliable source of grain.
Yeah. Settling down in farming suddenly doesn't seem so bad when you've got a good drink in mind, huh?
Haha, totally. It's like the original beer run turned into a whole agricultural revolution.
The ultimate quest for a good time.
All right.
But let's get back to the hangover itself. How did people in ancient times view this whole experience?
Well, for that, we can turn to one of the oldest medical texts in the world, the Sushruta Samhita. The Sushruta Samhita. It's a Sanskrit text, dates back to the 6th century BCE, and it actually contains what might be the earliest medical description of a hangover.
Okay, so spill the ancient medical tea. What did they call a hangover, and what did they think caused it?
They called it paramata, and their description: thirst, headache, body aches, loss of taste.
Sounds painfully familiar.
Right, it really hasn't changed much, has it?
I guess some things are just timeless. But let's be honest, even with all our modern science, we haven't fully figured out hangovers.
It's true. Hangovers are more complex than they seem. There are all these ethical concerns with studying them. You can't exactly make people get hangovers for research.
Yeah, that wouldn't fly.
Plus, everyone reacts to alcohol differently. Genetics, drinking habits, what you mix your drinks with, it all plays a role.
So pinning down a universal cause and cure, not so easy, even with all our fancy technology.
Not easy at all.
But that brings us to perhaps the most important question. How did people throughout history try to cope with hangovers?
Well, let me tell you, they weren't just toughing it out every time. Throughout history, people have come up with a crazy variety of hangover cures.
Okay, I am all ears. Herbal concoctions, strange rituals, spill the historical hangover secrets.
You might be surprised to learn that one of the most enduring hangover cures has roots in both folk medicine and, get this, magic.
Magic? We're talking about the hair of the dog, right?
You got it. Having another drink to cure your hangover.
Come on, isn't it just delaying the inevitable?
You're not wrong, but the origins of that phrase are pretty interesting. It likely comes from an old folk belief that if a dog bit you, you could prevent rabies by putting hair from that same dog into the wound.
Wait, seriously, that's where hair of the dog comes from. Okay, I gotta admit, that's pretty wild. But how did that logic get applied to hangovers?
It's sympathetic magic. Like cures, like.
Right.
You're suffering from too much alcohol, so a little more might just set things right.
Fight fire with fire, huh? But what other cures were people trying back then?
Oh, we're just getting started. Folklorist Frank M. Polson collected hangover cures for years, and his research is like a bizarre grocery list. We're talking raw cabbage, tomato juice. He even found people who believed in a secret hangover cure pill being kept from the public.
A secret hangover pill. Now that's a conspiracy theory I haven't heard before. But what about actual food? Surely people weren't just chasing raw eggs with tomato juice.
You'd be surprised. But there are also some hangover-inspired culinary creations we still enjoy today, like Eggs Benedict.
Eggs Benedict. Okay, I'm officially intrigued.
Yeah.
What do Eggs Benedict have to do with hangovers?
Legend has it that this brunch classic was invented by a Wall Street broker named Lemuel Benedict. Back in 1894, after the rough night, he stumbled into a restaurant and requested poached eggs, bacon, and hollandaise sauce on toast.
And just like that, a hangover cure was born, disguised as a fancy brunch dish. I love it.
Right, but let's not forget the drinks. Besides hair of the dog, did any hangover-inspired cocktails take off?
Well, what about the Bloody Mary? It's like the poster child for combining various hangover cure theories into one drink.
Vodka, hair of the dog, tomato juice, vitamins and electrolytes, Worcestershire sauce, and hot sauce. Gotta have that spicy kick.
Like a one-stop shop for hangover relief.
Right.
But how did this tomatoey vodka concoction become so famous?
Well, the origins are a little murky. Some say bartender Fernand Pidiot at Harry's New York bar in Paris in the 1920s. Others claim it was invented in New York City.
So the true inventor might be lost to history, but its status as a hangover helper, that's undeniable. But let's be real, do any of these historical hangover cures actually work? Or are they just elaborate placebos?
Ah, the million-dollar question. The answer, probably not.
So all those raw eggs, spicy concoctions, even the hair of the dog, it's all psychological
The
comfort.
placebo effect is powerful, and there's something to be said for the comfort of a familiar ritual. But hard evidence, not so much.
Hasn't there been research into hangover cures?
There have been studies, but the results are often inconclusive. For example, a 2021 study in the journal Addiction evaluated 21 placebo-controlled trials of various supposed cures: turmeric, probiotics, red ginseng, even Korean pear juice.
Okay, so they covered a lot of ground. What did they find? Any winners?
Some showed some improvement, but the study concluded the evidence was pretty weak. Small sample sizes, lack of diversity, potential bias.
So even the promising ones weren't solid enough to draw conclusions.
Exactly. And that was just one study. It didn't even scratch the surface of all the supposed cures out there. So we can't say for sure that nothing works, but the science just isn't there yet.
So the quest for a scientifically proven hangover cure continues. What are we poor sufferers supposed to do in the meantime? Just suffer in silence.
Well, there might not be a magic bullet, but there are things you can do to minimize the damage or at least lessen the blow. The best strategy, moderation, of course.
Easier said than done sometimes.
True. But if you do overindulge, staying hydrated is key.
Water is your best friend, especially when alcohol is involved. But is there anything else we can do to fight a hangover before it even starts?
Some people find that an over-the-counter pain reliever and a multivitamin before bed can help, but gotta stress this. Avoid acetaminophen. It can be hard on your liver, especially when you've been drinking.
Duly noted. Hydrate, maybe pop a pain reliever and some vitamins, and remember, moderation is key.
Yeah.
But are there any historical hangover cures that have actually stood the test of time and made it into modern medicine?
That's a great question. While a lot of old-time cures might not have much scientific backing, some of the ingredients and approaches they used actually have surprising connections to modern hangover prevention.
Interesting. So, which historical cures might actually have some merit, even if folks back then didn't fully understand why?
Well, let's think about the humble egg again. A staple in so many hangover remedies, and for good reason. Eggs are full of cysteine.
Cysteine.
It's an amino acid that helps break down acetaldehyde, one of those nasty byproducts of alcohol that makes you feel so awful.
So even if our ancestors didn't know about cysteine, they were onto something with their egg-based cures. It's like they instinctively knew.
Exactly. It goes to show that sometimes those old wives' tales actually have a grain of truth to them.
Fascinating. It's like we're rediscovering ancient wisdom about how our bodies deal with alcohol. But what about spicy food? Was there any reason behind that, or were they just punishing an already upset stomach?
Well, while spicy food might seem counterintuitive for a delicate stomach, there might actually be some science behind it. Capsaicin, what gives chili peppers their heat, also has pain-reducing properties.
So that fiery kick might actually be helping to numb the pain of a hangover headache. Who knew? What about salty foods? Were those just for electrolytes or something more?
Electrolyte replenishment is definitely a factor. Alcohol dehydrates you, and you lose essential electrolytes like sodium and potassium.
Right, which explains why sports drinks are a go-to for some people. But did people in the past understand electrolytes?
They might not have had the scientific understanding we have today, but they definitely noticed that salty foods seemed to help. It was probably a mix of instinct, observation, and tradition that led to those salty hangover remedies.
So once again, they might have been onto something, even without knowing the exact why. What about hydration itself? Was that a big thing for hangover cures throughout history?
Absolutely. The importance of fluids, especially water, has been known for centuries. Even without knowing about dehydration in a scientific sense, people would have noticed that drinking water made them feel better.
Amazing how some of the most basic hangover remedies have been passed down for generations, even without modern science to back them up. But what about sleep? Was that considered a key part of hangover recovery?
Sleep was definitely seen as crucial for healing. Many historical hangover cures involved rest and relaxation, like the original Netflix and chill for hangover recovery.
Uh-huh, I love it. But seriously, it makes sense. Alcohol messes with your sleep, makes you exhausted. Getting some good rest seems logical for recovery.
Right. And they might not have known about how alcohol messes with sleep cycles, but they would have noticed that a good night's sleep usually made you feel better.
So even though we understand hangovers better now, a lot of the basic principles, hydration, good food, rest, have been around for centuries. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about how hangovers show up in art and literature.
Oh, yeah. Because, let's face it, a good hangover story is always entertaining.
Totally. So are there any famous paintings or sculptures that capture the agony or maybe the humor of a hangover?
Well, it's tricky to pinpoint hangover imagery in art. How do you know for sure if someone is drunk, hungover, or just having a bad day?
That's a good point. It's all open to interpretation.
Hmm.
So how can we tell if a piece of art is about hangovers?
Sometimes the title gives it away. There's a painting from the late 1880s by Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec called The Hangover. It shows a woman slumped over a table with a look of utter despair. Empty wine bottle and glass right there in the scene, no mistaking what's going on.
Sounds like a classic hangover portrait. But what about artwork that's not so obvious? How do we interpret those?
You gotta look at the details, the overall mood. There's a painting from 1665 by Jan Steen called The Effects of Intemperance. Chaotic household scene, kids running wild, adults passed out.
Painting a picture of the morning after, literally.
Exactly. It doesn't explicitly say hangover, but you get the idea.
So what kind of themes or motifs pop up in hangover-related artwork?
Regret's a big one. Hangover sufferers often look remorseful, guilty, even ashamed. It's that classic, why did I do that feeling.
Art imitating life, or rather, art imitating hangover. But what about humor? Surely hangovers have inspired some funny art too.
Of course. Hangovers are full of those absurd symptoms and behaviors that lend themselves to comedy. Think of those cartoons where someone wakes up with birds circling their head and their tongue feels like sandpaper.
Huh. There's something inherently funny about that exaggerated hangover misery. But what about literature? Any famous hangover tales out there?
Oh, tons. Writers have been using hangovers to explore themes of excess, consequences, the human condition, you name it.
Okay, I'm ready for some literary examples. Which authors have really nailed the hangover experience?
Can't talk about hangovers in literature without mentioning Samuel Pepys, the 17th century diarist. His diaries are full of accounts of his drinking adventures and the often regrettable aftermaths.
Wait, Samuel Pepys? The guy who wrote about the Great Plague and the Great Fire of London?
Yep, that's him. He documented everything, including his hangovers, headaches, nausea, regrets about overindulging.
So basically the original hangover blogger.
Pretty much. And his descriptions are so vivid, even without using the word hangover. That term didn't appear in writing until the late 19th century.
Wow, so even without the word, he captured the experience perfectly. What about other writers? Anyone else take on the hangover in a memorable way?
How about some 17th century humor? In Reuben Bourne's 1692 play, The Contented Cuckold, there's a hilarious conversation about hangovers.
Now I'm all ears. What's this 17th century hangover wisdom?
One character, Sparkish, is complaining about his wine headache, and his friend, Friendly, gives him some advice. He says, "Bear up, man. Never give way in good company for the headache or disaffected stomach. 'Tis so childish, I am ashamed to hear thee name it. One bottle sets thee right again and makes thee sound as a rock. There's no medicine I know like it."
Wait, he's suggesting another drink as a cure. The hair of the dog strikes again.
Right. And it's funny how that idea has persisted for centuries.
It's like the hangover version of Walk It Off. But besides the humor, what does this tell us about how people viewed hangovers back then?
Well, it suggests that hangovers were a normal thing, even a source of comedy. And while Friendly's advice is terrible medically, it does reflect that enduring belief in the power of alcohol to cure its own ill effects.
Confidence of the hungover. But it also highlights how attitudes toward alcohol and its consequences have changed. What might have been a joke back then might be seen as a problem today.
Absolutely. It's all about perspective.
We're looking at hangovers through a historical lens, trying to understand the cultural and societal influences that shaped how people viewed them. But speaking of history, let's dive back into the world of hangover cures. We've talked about hair of the dog, but what other crazy remedies did people come up with?
Oh, the list is never ending. From ancient potions to bizarre concoctions, people have tried everything under the sun to find hangover relief. And some of these cures are so strange, so out there, that they deserve a closer look.
Okay, you've definitely got me curious. What kind of weird and wonderful hangover cures are we talking about? Ancient rituals, strange ingredients. Give me the historical hangover lowdown.
Imagine a world where a raw prairie oyster is considered a hangover cure, or where warm beer was thought to magically banish a headache.
A raw prairie oyster. Hold on, what in the world is that?
Get ready because it's not pretty. A raw egg yolk, Worcestershire sauce, hot sauce, and salt all mixed together and swallowed like a shot.
Oof, that sounds like a recipe for disaster. But people actually drank that. Willingly.
Believe it or not, yes. And the prairie oyster is just the tip of the iceberg. There are so many more strange and unusual hangover cures out there just waiting to be discovered.
All right, you've convinced me we're diving deeper into the weird world of hangover cures. Bring on the bizarre concoctions.
Well, picture this. You wake up with a pounding headache and someone offers you burnt toast soaked in wine. Or maybe a vinegar and rosewater mixture. Feeling adventurous? Try a drink made with ground up boar's tusk.
Okay, those sound more like punishments than cures. What was the thinking behind these bizarre combinations?
That's what's so fascinating. A lot of these cures were based on ancient theories of humors, the belief that the body was ruled by four fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. And any imbalances in these humors were thought to cause illness. Hangovers, no exception.
So basically, they were trying to rebalance their systems with these weird concoctions.
Exactly, like a medieval detox movie.
And while those theories about humors might seem outdated now, it's a reminder that people have always tried to understand and take control of their bodies.
Exactly. They were working with the knowledge they had at the time. But besides those humors, what else influenced the development of these hangover cures?
Well, I imagine the availability of ingredients played a role.
Absolutely. If a certain plant or animal was abundant in a region, it often found its way into their hangover remedies. It's like, hey, we've got a ton of this, let's see if it helps.
Makes perfect sense. But were these cures mostly passed down through families? Or were people constantly experimenting with new hangover fixes?
Probably a bit of both. Traditional cures definitely got passed down, but people were always experimenting with new ingredients and approaches. Gotta find something that works, right?
The never-ending search for hangover relief. But were any of these cures actually effective? Or was it all just wishful thinking?
Tough to say for sure. Like we've talked about, it's hard to prove if those historical cures actually worked or if they were just placebos.
Right, the power of belief. But it's still amazing to see the lengths people went to for hangover relief.
Oh, absolutely. It really shows how determined they were to find a solution, no matter how strange or unusual the methods. And even if we chuckle at some of those cures today, they give us a peek into the past. Beliefs, medical practices, and that age-old struggle to cope with, well, overdoing it.
Totally. We're not alone in our quest for hangover relief. It's a universal human experience that's been going on for centuries.
Exactly. And it's a good reminder that while science is starting to understand hangovers a bit better, the search for that ultimate cure, well, that goes on.
Speaking of cures that have stood the test of the time, we've talked about hair of the dog, but what about others? Any other cures with that kind of staying power?
You know, it's really interesting how some hangover cures have just transcended time and cultures.
Yeah, it's kind of wild. We've talked about hair of the dog, but are there any others that have been around forever?
Well, think about the humble egg. It's a staple in hangover breakfasts worldwide. Turns out, eggs might actually have some real science behind them when it comes to hangovers.
Wait, seriously. I always thought eggs were just a greasy, comforting hangover food. What makes them so special?
They're packed with cysteine. It's an amino acid that helps your body process acetaldehyde, one
Okay.
of the main things that contributes to those nasty hangover symptoms.
So even though our ancestors didn't know about cysteine, they were onto something with their egg-based cures. It's incredible how they figured that out.
Right, the power of observation. Even without modern scientific knowledge, they found remedies that actually worked.
That's so cool. It's like we're uncovering hidden wisdom in these old hangover cures. What about spicy food? Was there any logic to that, or was it just a way to punish an already upset stomach?
Well, while you might think spicy food is the last thing you want with a sensitive stomach, there might actually be some science to it. Capsaicin, the thing that makes chili peppers hot, can help with pain.
So that fiery kick might actually be helping with a hangover headache. Who would have thought?
Isn't it fascinating? Even those strange-sounding remedies sometimes have a scientific explanation, even if they didn't fully get it back then.
But what about salty foods? Were those just for electrolytes, or was there something more to them?
Replenishing electrolytes is definitely important. Alcohol makes you dehydrated, and you lose electrolytes like sodium and potassium.
Right, which is why some people swear by sports drinks. But did people in the past really understand electrolytes?
They might not have known the science behind it the way we do today, but they definitely observed that salty foods seem to help. It was probably a combination of instinct, observation, and tradition that led to those salty hangover remedies.
So, yet again, they were onto something, even if they didn't understand the science behind it. What about hydration in general? Was that emphasized as a hangover cure throughout history?
Absolutely. People have known about the importance of fluids, especially water, for ages. Even without understanding dehydration scientifically, they could see that drinking water helped.
It's amazing how some of the simplest hangover remedies have been passed down for generations, even before modern science could back them up. But what about sleep? Was that considered an essential part of hangover recovery?
Sleep was definitely seen as crucial for getting better. So many historical hangover cures involved rest and relaxation. It was like their version of Netflix and chill.
Aha, I love it. But seriously, it makes sense. Alcohol disrupts your sleep, leaves you exhausted. Getting some good rest is a logical way to help your body bounce back.
Right. They might not have known how alcohol messed with sleep cycles, but they observed that a good night's sleep usually made you feel better.
So even though we have a better understanding of hangovers now, many of those basic principles, hydration, good food, rest, have been recognized for centuries. But you know what? Let's switch gears for a minute. Let's talk about the folklore around hangovers. Every culture has its own set of beliefs and superstitions about hangovers, right?
Absolutely. Hangovers have always been a bit mysterious with those unpleasant symptoms. It's no wonder they inspired so much folklore and superstition throughout history.
Okay, spill the tea. What kind of wild beliefs are we talking about? Ancient curses, mystical creatures? Give me the supernatural hangover scoop.
Well, in some cultures, people blamed hangovers on supernatural forces, like they saw it as punishment for indulging too much. For example, in ancient Mesopotamia, they believed a hangover was caused by a demon called Alu.
A hangover demon.
Seriously.
Yep, they believe this demon would attach itself to anyone who drank too much.
Now that's terrifying. Did they do anything to appease this Alu demon? They sure did. Incantations, offerings, you name it. There were pretty common ways to try and get rid of the demon and ease those hangover symptoms.
Wow, that's a classic example of trying to explain something they didn't understand scientifically.
Right.
But what other kinds of hangover folklore were out there?
Well, in some cultures, certain animals were thought to either cause or cure hangovers. For example, in parts of Europe, people believed that you could cure a hangover by drinking a potion made with hair from the dog that bit you.
Wait a second, doesn't that sound familiar? Isn't that where the phrase hair of the dog comes from?
You got it. Classic example of sympathetic magic. The idea that, like, cures like. So if a dog bite was causing you trouble, the logic was that something from that same dog could fix it.
Wow, that's wild. What other animals were involved in hangover folklore?
In ancient Rome, owls were thought to be bad news for hangovers. Pliny the Elder, a Roman naturalist, even suggested using owl eggs as a hangover cure.
Owl eggs. Now, that's a new one. But it seems like these animal-based cures were more about symbolism than anything else, right?
Yeah, probably. But it's interesting how people incorporated their beliefs about the natural world into their hangover remedies.
It really gives you a glimpse into how they saw the world. But aside from animals and demons, were there any other strange hangover beliefs out there?
In some cultures, they believed certain objects or rituals could ward off hangovers. Some people in Europe thought wearing a copper bracelet would do the trick.
A copper bracelet.
Yeah.
That sounds more like a fashion statement than a hangover cure.
Haha, right. But hey, it's no stranger than some of the other remedies we've talked about. I think it shows how creative people have always been when it comes to finding ways to avoid or ease a hangover.
Absolutely. It's like a reminder that even when faced with a splitting headache, humans always find a way to inject a bit of hope and even humor into the situation.
Couldn't have said it better. And it shows our enduring fascination with hangovers. They continue to inspire folklore, superstition, and even scientific inquiry.
So, while we might not have a foolproof hangover cure yet, exploring the folklore surrounding them gives us a really unique and entertaining perspective on the human experience.
Exactly. And who knows? Maybe somewhere in those ancient beliefs and traditions, there's a piece of wisdom that could lead us to a brighter, less hungover future.
I love that idea. But for now, let's bring it back down to earth and talk about how hangovers had impacted society and culture. Because let's face it, hangovers affect everything from work to our social lives.
Absolutely. Hangovers aren't just something we experience individually. They've really shaped how we work, how we play, and even how we connect with each other.
Okay, so how have hangovers influenced society? What's the historical impact?
Well, think about brunch. It's a beloved weekend tradition, but its origins might be tied to hangovers.
Wait, seriously,
Mhm.
brunch was invented for hangovers.
Maybe not officially invented, but food historians think it gained popularity as a way to deal with the after effects of a Saturday night out.
That makes so much sense. Late start time, heavy food, and often, well, a few more drinks. It's perfect for those recovering from a night of overindulgence.
Exactly. It's like a socially acceptable way to acknowledge that, yeah, maybe you had a little too much fun the night before.
Oh, it's like a hangover support group, disguised as a delicious meal. But aside from brunch, how else have hangovers shaped our social interactions?
Think about how much we talk about hangovers. We swap stories, we commiserate, we share advice on cures. It's a common experience that helps us connect.
The universal language of misery and regret. But have hangovers always been seen as something we could joke about? Or were they once considered a bigger deal?
Attitudes toward hangovers have definitely shifted over time. In some historical periods, drinking too much and dealing with the consequences, well, it wasn't seen in a positive light.
So it wasn't just a physical problem, it was a moral failing.
In some cases, yeah. Overindulging was linked to laziness, lack of self-control, things like that. Those weren't exactly admirable traits.
So a hangover wasn't just about feeling bad, it was about your reputation.
Exactly. If you were frequently hungover, it could really damage your standing in the community.
It's wild how a hangover could impact your whole life. But as societies changed, how did attitudes toward hangovers change?
As we learn more about alcohol and how it affects the body, the moral judgment surrounding hangovers started to fade. And with advances in medicine, the focus shifted from blaming people to understanding the biological processes involved.
So instead of thinking a hangover was caused by demons or weak character, we started to see it as a result of, well, drinking too much.
Exactly. It became a medical issue, not a moral one. And that made it easier to talk openly and honestly about alcohol and its effects.
Right. Instead of pretending hangovers didn't exist, we started acknowledging them,
Yeah.
sharing our experiences,
Oh,
even laughing about them.
exactly. And that open dialogue is crucial for promoting responsible drinking and reducing the negative effects of alcohol.
It's like we went from demonizing hangovers to recognizing them as a shared human experience, something we can learn and grow from.
Well said. It's a reminder that even though hangovers aren't fun, they can be a chance for reflection and self-improvement.
So even if we never discover that magical hangover cure, we can at least appreciate the cultural and social significance of this age-old phenomenon.
Absolutely. And you never know, maybe by learning about the history of hangovers and how people have tried to cure them, we can gain a better understanding of our own relationship with alcohol.
That's a fantastic point. But for now, we're going to take a little break and dive into some listener mail. Because as they say, a hangover might fade, but a good story is forever. Welcome back. We've been on quite the journey exploring the world of hangovers. The history, the science, the folklore, the social impact. It's incredible how much there is to learn about this age-old companion to a night of, shall we say, overindulgence.
I know, right? From ancient hangover demons to the science of cysteine in eggs, it's been a fascinating deep dive.
We've barely scratched the surface, though. There's so much more to uncover. But as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a thought to ponder.
Ooh, I love a good thought-provoking question. What you got?
Well, we've explored all these different sides of hangovers, but ultimately, each of us has our own unique relationship with this experience. So the question I think we should all ask ourselves is, what does your go-to hangover cure say about you?
I love that. Is it a practical, science-backed approach? Is it a comforting tradition passed down from your grandma? Or maybe it's something a little more out there, a reflection of your adventurous side.
Exactly. Our hangover cures, whether they're proven by science or steeped in folklore, can reveal a lot about us. Our beliefs, our influences, even our personalities.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? Those little things we do when we're feeling rough might say more about us than we realize.
So to everyone listening, I challenge you. Think about your go-to hangover cure. What's the story behind it? What does it say about you? Maybe it's a family recipe, a scientific strategy, or a quirky concoction that you swear by.
And remember, even if we haven't found the ultimate hangover cure yet, the search is part of the fun. It's a journey through history, culture, science, and our own beliefs and experiences.
Well said. So until next time, Stay curious, stay hydrated, and maybe think twice before that next round.
Cheers to that. And thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We'll be back soon with another fascinating exploration.